All right. Have you ever stopped to wonder how we actually know what we know about society? You know, how sociologists can make these big claims about things like crime rates or family life or what's happening in our schools. Well, today we're going to pry open their toolbox and see exactly how they do it, how they uncovered the secrets of our social world. Okay, let's just dive right into the deep end. This is the central challenge, isn't it? Society isn't some neat little chemical reaction you can control in a test tube. Nope. It's a messy, complex, always changing web of millions of us. So how on earth do you study that with any kind of scientific rigor? That's the huge puzzle that drives all of this research. To get our heads around that question, it really helps to think of all these research methods as a set of specialized tools, kind of like what you'd find in a mechanic's workshop. You wouldn't use a hammer to saw a piece of wood, right? And in the same way, you wouldn't use a simple survey to try and understand a really complex historical event. And this is the absolute key. To answer those big social questions, researchers have to pick the right tool for the right kind of evidence. The method you choose completely shapes the kind of answers you can even get. So, let's start with the first tray in our toolkit. This is where we find all the methods for analyzing data that's already out there. You can almost think of it as social archaeology. We're sifting through all the clues that society has already left behind for us to find. And in this tray, we find two main kinds of clues. On one hand, you've got these massive, government-level official statistics. They give you that huge bird's-eye view. And on the other hand, you have these incredibly intimate personal documents, things like diaries and letters, that give you the close-up personal story. They're both clues, for sure, but they tell wildly different kinds of stories. Let's look a little closer at those statistics. Sociologists often talk about hard statistics. Now, this is data that's super reliable, and that's because it's recorded by law. Take divorces, for example. A divorce has to be legally registered. So the records of how many happen each year, they're going to be very, very accurate. You can't really argue with that number. But then you've got soft statistics. And this data can be a bit more, well, slippery. A great example is the unemployment rate. One government might change how it defines unemployed. Maybe you have to be actively looking for work to be counted. Well, as soon as that definition changes, the numbers change too, which makes comparing data over time really, really tricky. And this brings us to the biggest limitation of all statistics. They are absolutely fantastic at showing us the big patterns, the what. The classic example is Emil Durkheim's famous study on suicide. He used official stats to show that suicide rates were different between different social groups, but those numbers alone could never, ever tell him why a specific individual made that tragic choice. So let's switch over to that other type of clue. Personal documents. These can give you an incredible, rich level of detail. I mean, the Diary of Anne Frank gives us a window into a real lived experience that no statistic ever could. But, and this is a big but, you have to be so careful. Is the document even real? Is it telling the whole story? A single diary is, after all, just one person's view, and it's definitely not representative of everyone. So, what happens when the clues that are already out there just aren't enough? Well, then you have to go out and create your own data. This next set of tools in our kit is all about asking people questions directly, through things like surveys, questionnaires, and interviews. And when you're asking questions, the type of question you ask is everything. A closed-ended question like, do you own this textbook? Yes or no, gives you clean data you can easily count. It's quantifiable. But an open-ended question like, so, what do you like about studying sociology? That gives you rich, qualitative insights into what someone is actually thinking and feeling. Questionnaires are a perfect example of this trade-off. On one hand, they're great for reaching a ton of people really quickly, and because they're often anonymous, people might be more honest. But the response rates are often incredibly low, which can totally skew your results. Plus, you can't really dig into complex, nuanced issues with just a simple multiple-choice question.
Now, the moment you move away from a written questionnaire to a real, face-to-face interview, you run into a huge potential problem. It is such a fundamental challenge in sociology that it gets its own very dramatic slide, the interviewer effect.
So what is it? Well, it's the way the interaction itself can totally change the answers a person gives. Sometimes people will try to help the researcher by giving the answers they think are correct, or that will make them look good. Or the researcher's own identity, their age, their gender, their ethnicity, could make the person being interviewed uncomfortable, which can totally bias their answers. The simple act of being watched changes everything. Which brings us to our most powerful and probably our most difficult set of tools. You see, sometimes we don't just want to find patterns, we want to find causes. We want to know not just what is happening, but why it's happening. And for that, we need experiments.
Okay, but before we go any further, we have to get this straight. This is one of the most important ideas in all of science. Correlation is not causation. Correlation is just when two things happen at the same time. The classic example, ice cream sales and shark attacks both go up in the summer. That's a correlation. Causation is when one thing actually makes the other thing happen. The summer heat causes ice cream sales to rise. The ice cream does not cause the shark attacks. Experiments are designed to separate those two things.
Let's look at a famous field experiment that just illustrates this brilliantly. Researchers Rosenthal and Jacobson gave a bunch of students an IQ test. Then they randomly picked a few students and told their teachers, hey, these kids right here are special. They're late developers and they're about to have a major academic growth spurt. A year later, they retested everyone. And what do you think happened? The IQ scores of those randomly selected students had shot way up. The teacher's expectations actually caused a change in student performance. Amazing, right?
But even experiments have their own pitfalls, and the most famous one is called the Hawthorne effect. It was discovered way back in a factory, where researchers were testing if changing the lighting would improve worker productivity. But here's the wild part. Productivity went up no matter what they did. Brighter lights, dimmer lights, it didn't matter. Why? Because the workers knew they were being studied. They were working harder simply because someone was paying attention to them.
I mean, think about it in your own life. Do you drive a little differently when you spot a police car in your rearview mirror? Do you maybe work a little harder when you know your boss is walking by your desk? That's the Hawthorne effect, right there. The very act of observing something changes the reality that you're trying to observe. So, as we've seen, every single tool in the Sociologist's kit has its own unique strengths, and it also has its own critical weaknesses. There's no such thing as a single best method. The real skill is knowing exactly which tool to choose for which specific job.
This table really pulls it all together. If you want to see those big, sweeping historical patterns, you use secondary data, but you give up knowing the why. If you want opinions from huge groups of people, surveys are your go-to tool, but you've got to worry about things like the interviewer effect. And if you absolutely need to find cause and effect, you turn to experiments, but then you have to constantly fight against that sneaky Hawthorne effect.
So here's the real takeaway. Now that you've had a peek inside the toolkit, you're equipped to be a much more critical consumer of information. The next time you see a headline that says, "New study shows," you can stop and ask, what tool did they use to find that out? What are the limitations of that tool? And maybe most importantly, what questions might they have missed?